Well, it is a privilege to be here. Wonderful always to come up and hang out with the folks here at St. Michael and All Angels. I always enjoy my time. I said it was worth noting twice that I'm academic dean because it feels like it's two jobs. But it's wonderful. I bring you greetings from all of the folks down at Seminary of the Southwest, where we are busy training and preparing new groups of priests who are sending out into the church, and it's good and it's exciting work. This morning, what I want to talk about is what we've got up here on the screen, this idea of bonds of affection in a culture of isolation. And the language of bonds of affection is actually language that is fairly familiar in the Episcopal Church and in the context of the Anglican Communion. It's language that we've been using for quite a while to describe what holds us together. So often we'll say, well, you know, we have these churches all over the world and we're all part of the Anglican Communion. What makes us one? We don't have a pope, we don't have a single hierarchy that lands on one person or even one group of people. We're autonomous bodies. What makes us one? And again we come back to this phrase, bonds of affection that hold us together. And sometimes I think we make use of that phrase and we're not exactly sure what we mean by it, but it sounds pretty good. And we know that it doesn't mean that we all agree with everybody on everything, but there's something that knits us together with one another. And so I want to explore that idea a little bit this morning, that idea that is in some ways a distinctly Anglican idea, but to think about it not just in terms of how we hold together as a church body, but how we think about our relation to other people outside the church, how we think about our relationships here within the context of a particular church community, a particular parish, and especially to correlate it with, to think about the connection between this idea of bonds of affection and a culture in which many of us feel like we push further and further into pockets of isolation. What do we do in a culture like that? And how can this language, this idea of affection, help us respond to that sort of cultural reality? The isolation of youth, I think, is one of the big things that a lot of us worry about. Teen suicide is the third highest cause of death among teens, and in many of those instances, it's a situation where isolation has produced a context where this feels like the only out. You don't need to run through a whole lot of statistics to recognize the ways in which teen isolation is a problem in our culture. A number of years ago, Foster the People came out with this huge song, Pumped Up Kicks. And Mark Foster, the leader of Foster the People, recently said in an NPR interview that the song, which if you just listen to the music, it sounds like just a really kind of high-energy pop song, and then you listen to the words and you realize it's a song about school shootings. You know, so it's one of those songs that sort of tricks you in, and then you listen to the words and you realize there's something deep and troubling going on underneath this. And what Mark Foster had to say is that this song was about isolation and teenage culture and the kind of trends in youth violence. Seeing that connection between isolation and violence and things that are happening in teen culture. So we could go on with that, but for a lot of us it's fairly intuitive to note that that's occurring in teen culture. We could also look at the other end, isolation among the elderly. This is also a big issue in our culture, and as you can see from some of the statistics, folks over 65, 37% of women and 20% of men live alone. And that's over the age of 65, so you're looking at, you know, for many people, another 20 years, 25 years, maybe 30 years of living by yourself. What can really easily happen in that context is we become people who feel cut off, who feel isolated, who lack a sense of community and a sense of support. And one study that was done recently actually showed that older folks can bear loneliness, but the sense of social isolation actually has an impact on life expectancy. People will die younger if they feel like they are socially isolated. So interesting statistics, but again, something that we might sort of intuitively grasp. When you're alone, when you feel cut off, when you feel like you don't have a support system, it's much harder to press through even the small troubles of everyday life. So what do we do in the face of that? I want to call us back to this beautiful passage of Scripture. You'll notice on the opening slide, I had a quote from this particular passage. And this is Paul writing in 1 Corinthians. It's probably one of the most famous passages in the New Testament because so many people use this passage at their weddings. And so for a lot of us, we think, oh, this is all about weddings, right? This is about married love, romantic love. But for Paul, this is just being the church, right? This is just what it looks like to be the church. And so he says, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but to have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. All right, so Paul comes up with this great list. Right? He's thinking through, like, what's all the awesome stuff we can do? What are the amazing things we can do as a church community, right? And I'm going to list them all out. And then I'm going to tell you that if you do any of these awesome things, but you don't have love, it's nothing. It's nothing, right? So it's as if for Paul, what buoys all of these things, what makes all of these things matter is that they're done with love, not simply that they're done. And it's easy in a church context, it's easy in the context of lots of groups and organizations to imagine that the most important thing is that we get things done. Right? There's even a book by that title. Many of us have probably read it, right? Getting things done. We get good at getting things done. But what Paul wants to say is you can get a whole lot of stuff done, but if you have not love, you've missed the point of why you're getting things done. And so I want us to be thinking about that idea of love. What would it mean for the church to be that place where we're interjecting love into this culture of isolation, and not in a sort of flimsy sense, right? I mean, in some ways it feels like too easy an answer, right? We've got a culture of isolation. Well, we need more love. But I want to dig a little bit deeper and ask, what kind of love? What does that love look like? C.S. Lewis has a beautiful book. I commend it to you. It's just entitled The Four Loves. And in this book, he tracks through 4 different types of love, basically building off of 4 Greek words for love. The first being agape, which is the love that is usually used in the New Testament, the term that's used for God's love for us, a kind of gifting love. And you might think that this is exactly where we'd want to go to, that this would be the most important love, and in certain ways it is. But there's also a danger with this gifting, this grace-filled love. And here's where I think the danger is. Sometimes when we think of love as agape or gift or charity, we think of love that pretty much moves one direction. Those who have something give to those who don't. And then it's done, right? We've done that act of love. Agape, I think, as it's spoken of in the New Testament, actually imagines something richer, something much more reciprocating. But in our current culture, when that kind of love then gets translated into what we call charity, it's a one-directional movement. It's not something that necessarily creates relationship. And remember, the thing we're worried about here is isolation. It's not that we're worried about, like, there are plenty of things to worry about in the world, but the thing we're worried about right now, we're trying to think through, is the problem of being isolated, not the problem of not having enough food or not having enough money to pay your rent. Those are all very real issues that people wrestle with. But you can have enough money to buy food and you can have enough money to pay rent, but if you are isolated, if you are cut off from other people, then you're losing something of what it means to be fully human. So as long as we think of agape, gift love, grace love, charity love as one direction of gift that doesn't produce relationship, then we haven't yet gotten at a kind of love that challenges that deep problem of isolation. So Lewis goes on and he says, well, there are other types of love. One is philia, which is the Greek word for friendship. And you might think, well, that's it, right? That's what we need. We need to be involved in deepening our connection of friendship. Now, my first answer to that is yes. Clearly, awesome. But then you stop and think about that a little bit, and Lewis makes note of this in the book. How many people can you have real significant friendships with? Friendship requires time. You got to spend time with your friends or else you start to pull apart. It requires emotional energy, all good stuff. But think about how many people you would count as your real close friends, right? Not just acquaintances, but friends. It's usually for most of us a handful, because basically that's all the time we have in our lives to invest in a handful of other people. We can call these people our real friends. It's wonderful to develop friendships, but the truth is, even in a group this size, and this is only a small fragment of the community of St. Michael and All Angels, we can't have as our goal, I'm going to build friendships with everyone here. Right? It can't happen, right? You just don't have enough time. And not only do you not have enough time, but there's something about friendship that is based on some common interests, common connection, common views, common beliefs. There's something we hold in common that pulls us together. And you might look around and discover, you know, there's some people I don't really have that much in common with. So friendship might not be in the cards. It doesn't mean that person becomes my enemy. It just means friendship may not be in the cards in this or that particular relationship, and we don't have to feel guilty about it. It's just sort of the way the world is. So if we're going to try to encounter this problem of isolation, it can't be that I imagine I have to go out and find all sorts of isolated people and make them my friends, because we just don't have the capacity to make that happen. So we move on. We move on to Lewis's third type of love, eros, which is romantic love. But that's an even more limited kind of love, right? That's the love that we find for that one person, and we connect to that one person, and we have a kind of bond that we don't have with anyone else. So eros is not going to be our solution to widespread isolation. The fourth love that Lewis talks about, though, comes from this Greek word storge, and it's affection. And it's fascinating as Lewis discusses affection, because I think it's the love that is least talked about, at least in the church. Right? We have all sorts of times when we talk about these other kinds of loves. But very rarely do we stop and talk about affection, even though, again, it's right there embedded in one of the key phrases we use to talk about the Anglican Communion. Right? We're bound by bonds of affection. But then we're not sure what that is. It's not exactly friendship. It's not exactly agape. It's not exactly eros or romantic love. What is it? What kind of love is affection? And can affection be the term that helps us describe what it means to reach out and connect to one another across these patterns of isolation that have emerged? Lewis has this to say. Actually, he doesn't. On the next slide, he has something to say. But before he said that, I just wanted to sort of sum up how we might make affection significant, how we might think of its significance in terms of these things: building community, crossing boundaries. Right? Remember, I said friendship usually involves some sense of connection, of similarity, maybe shared views or shared interests. Friendship doesn't necessarily push us to cross boundaries, because we build friendships with those who are kind of like us. And I don't think we have to feel guilty about that. It's the nature of friendship. But we do need to figure out what is the kind of love that does push us across boundaries. With people who we might say, that person would never really be my friend, but I can find affection for that person. And I can actively seek to nurture affection for that person or those people who are in my community or near my community. And then the idea that being a people of affection really in some ways is about humanizing the everyday. Humanizing all of the small ways that we contact people throughout every day. So that's kind of just a quick overview of some of the things I want us to unpack in the next half hour or so. So Lewis had this to say about affection. He says, affection is indeed the least discriminating of loves. Almost anyone can become an object of affection. There need be no apparent fitness between those whom it unites. Affection can rub along with the most unpromising people. Yet, oddly enough, this very fact means that it can, in the end, make appreciations possible which, but for it, might never have existed. What a great line. I'm tempted just to read that over like 3 times, but there's not time to do it, right? But there's something that he nails just right here. Right? Because in affection, we rub along with the most unpromising people. We find ourselves in the midst of groups of people, some of whom we got to say we don't even like so much. We sort of don't get along. We have rough edges, or they have rough edges, or it just happens that our edges rub in just the wrong way, right? But he said affection is the kind of thing that can emerge, right? It can emerge with the curmudgeonly neighbor who sort of drives you crazy, you know, and keeps complaining about stuff. But over time, you live near this curmudgeonly neighbor, and you get used to saying hello to old Bob as he's out working in his yard, and you sort of shake your head and you think, oh, there's Bob, right? But it's exactly that moment of saying, oh, there's Bob, that you sense also there's a sort of affection for this curmudgeonly guy who lives down the street. Right? It has that possibility of cutting across the places that, as Lewis describes, might seem fairly unpromising. He goes on and says this, the truly wide taste in humanity. I love that phrase. The truly wide taste in humanity. He's just been talking about what it would mean to have wide taste in books, wide taste as a reader, right? Somebody who can read a whole lot of different genres and find something interesting in them. The really good reader finds something interesting across all the genres. And so he uses this as an analogy now for thinking about people. The truly wide taste in humanity will find something to appreciate in the cross-section of humanity whom one has to meet every day. In my experience, it is affection that creates this taste, teaching us first to notice, then to endure, then to smile at, then to enjoy, and finally to appreciate the people who happen to be there. This is a different kind of love, right? This is a different kind of love, and it's a kind of love we don't talk about a whole lot. But what he's describing, I think, is probably an experience many of us have had, right? That we notice someone, and then we realize, maybe I don't really like this person that much, and I just need to endure them. So it begins from noticing, and then it's, I can endure them. But then notice the process, right? Then to smile at. The possibility that I can come to smile at Bob next door, the curmudgeonly neighbor. Oh, there he goes again, right? But we're able to have a kind of appreciation begin to develop. And then he says we can enjoy and come to appreciate, which means I discover over time that Bob is more than just that curmudgeonly guy who complains about my yard or whatever it is he complains about, my dog who sometimes ends up in his yard, right? Whatever it is. Suddenly I begin to realize Bob's bigger than that. Right? There's more to him than just that. And so appreciation is that willingness to sort of push past those differences and to recognize that we move toward a place where a kind of love can emerge. So that's what Lewis is trying to get us to think about here. And the key being that it's not rooted in the same things friendship is rooted in, which is part of why it's so beautiful as a way of thinking about the church. We don't have to have shared interests. We don't have to have the same views on the hot button issues, right? Sometimes we think we do, even just to be part of a church with other people. You know, we better all share the same views on this, or else, you know, I think I better pull out. Or maybe you better pull out. To be in a position where we can recognize, you know, if I wanted to build a deep friendship with you and we had some fundamentally different views, it might be hard to happen, but I can build affection. And I can actively seek that affection with one another in my community, even across the places where we don't naturally connect. And that's okay. I don't have to feel guilty that we don't naturally connect, but I do have to extend myself enough to seek that kind of affection, to try to make this sort of love happen. So affection in church, I would say, is the place where we try to figure out how we cut across those boundaries. I think it's especially important at a place like St. Michael and All Angels, because you just got so many people here, right? You're not like some other Episcopal churches where they're really small and, you know, you just can't avoid being part of that small community because, you know, there are 50 of you. Well, that's not true here. So in a place like this, to feel like this is a community involves intentional focus, again, not necessarily on building friendships with everybody, but an intentional focus on building affection. How do we make that happen? How do we bring ourselves into contact with one another so that we can discover the gifts that are present in someone else, even if our first impression is, I'm not sure I want to spend a lot of time with you? And then there's affection as it pushes us across other boundaries, right, as we go outside of the church. This is an image. The gentleman in the middle is Father Emmanuel Katangale. Father Emmanuel and I taught for a while, so got to be good friends during our years of teaching. And Father Emmanuel's gone on now. He taught at Duke for a while, and then he got pulled away from Duke to Notre Dame to head a wonderful project there. Father Emmanuel originally came from Uganda, and when he came over to the United States, and he's a Catholic priest, and he came here and began to work in some Catholic parishes in the U.S. And I wanted to just note two stories that he likes to tell. One is a story of his time visiting a church in Malaysia. And at this church in Malaysia, he said they have an elaborate greeting process. Now, a lot of churches have some kind of greeting at the beginning. Maybe it's just in the form of people who have a badge that says welcome, right? I'm a welcomer, and we greet you, or ushers, or someone who greets you at the door. Other churches have a period in which you turn around and shake hands and say hi to people. That might also be called passing of the peace, but also sometimes it's something else. But lots of churches try to find a way to greet one another. Well, this church in Malaysia, he said, here's how they started the service. Everybody lined up outside the doors in two lines. And the people at the back of the line then began to make their way into the church, greeting every person on each side as they walked into the church. Kisses, hugs, handshakes, everybody greeted everybody, right? So you take these two lines and everybody makes their way down. So everybody has greeted. He said it took forever. This was very inefficient. But it was a way of building affection. Right? People you don't see that often, maybe people you haven't talked to too much, but what you do before you start worshiping with one another is just share a sign of connection. Right? You share a sign of connection. He said it was beautiful. And then he said after the service, lots of people had brought cans of Coca-Cola. So they have these cans of Coke that they're going to share in the fellowship time afterward. But he said what they do is then everybody brings their cans. You open up your can of Coke, and you pour it into a big pitcher. All the cans of Coke go into one pitcher. And then you pour into a cup of Coca-Cola, and then you pass it around, and everybody drinks from the same cup. And then when it's empty, you go back and you fill it up again, and you keep it passing around. Right? I mean, oh, the hygiene of it, right? It's terrible. But the thing was, this was another way that they just built connection. He said, you know, the funny thing is there were enough cans of Coke for everybody to have one. But they didn't do it that way. It was a way of physically showing a connectedness in that community, of cutting across whatever boundaries or differences might have been present there. So then another story Father Emmanuel likes to tell, which is not quite such a happy story, a story of coming to the United States from Uganda, and as he put it, discovering that I was a black man. Right? Because he said in Uganda, I was brown. In Uganda, right, those colors actually had to do with the colors of our skin, and there were so many shades and variations. So I was brown, right? There were other people who were black, and that had to do with they had darker shades of skin, right? But he said, I came to America, and I discovered I'm a black man. And when I discovered I'm a black man in America, I began to discover that there's different kinds of rules applied to me. So he said he tried to get a U.S. driver's license. And as any of you who have either if you remember your own process of learning to drive, or if you remember teaching kids how to drive, you remember that one of the hard things is always parallel parking. right? Over and over again, right? That parallel parking. So you got to find some place where you can go practice parallel parking, because you don't want to knock over the cones, or you got to try again. So he was in a neighborhood very near the church where he was the rector. And he was practicing parallel parking one evening, right? So he was driving up and down the street, finding places where he could pull in, parallel park, pull back out, drive a little bit, try again. Apparently one of the neighbors called the police. and said, there's a black man driving through our neighborhood, and he keeps parking and then driving along. I think he's scoping out our houses. And would you please come? So Father Emmanuel, priest of the Catholic Church right down the street, finds himself pulled over by the police. And they're asking him, you know, what are you up to here? What's going on here? And he explains to them, right, well, you know, I'm a priest in this neighborhood, and I'm from Uganda, and I'd like to get a U.S. driver's license. Right? In that moment, everything resolved. It was fine. But he said, I discovered for the first time what it meant, what was meant by the phrase driving while black. I discovered what that meant, because if I were white, nobody would have called the police on me. It was part of his discovery of what it means to be a black man and not a brown Ugandan. How do we take these instances, right, where we have these boundaries that sometimes separate us, that sometimes pull us apart, that sometimes make us look at the other and say, whoever that is, it's not like me, and therefore this person must be scary. How do we find ways to cut across those boundaries? And again, what I want to suggest is that this language of affection, this posture of affection, that says, no, I don't really understand his Ugandan culture. I'm not sure that Father Emmanuel and I really have much in common. Now, as I got to know him as a fellow professor, I found out we had lots in common, right? He was one of the most joyful people I'd ever known. But upon first gaze, you might say, I don't know, you know, a Catholic priest from Uganda, I don't know if we have anything in common. And so we ask, how do you build affection in that sort of context? What sort of practices, right? Whether it's the extended greeting practice of this Malaysian church or something else. How do we find ways to note connection across boundaries that often keep us divided? Finally, then, this idea of affection as a way of moving through the everyday. A way of engaging all sorts of experiences in our everyday lives. So up till now, I've been talking about ways that we try to actually help affection happen, right? Find ways to come together with one another, find ways to cross over those boundaries, even just to be in one another's presence. But what about all the everyday ways that we encounter people in our lives? Can we build affection there? Right? Because we move through our lives and we go to the store, we encounter clerks, we go to Starbucks, we encounter baristas, we encounter people walking down the street, we encounter people in the park. Are there ways in which our everyday lives become opportunities to be those people who are ready to build affection? Wendell Berry is one of my favorite authors. If you haven't read any of his stuff, I just suggest you start anywhere. Just pick up one of his books. You'll love it. He writes poetry, he writes fiction, he writes essays. Wendell Berry gave a lecture, the Jefferson Lecture for the National Endowment for the Humanities, a really prestigious lecture back in 2012. And he titled the lecture, "It All Turns on Affection." It all turns on affection. And what he was trying to do is imagine a different kind of economy, but also a different kind of ecology. Wendell Berry's a farmer. He's a Kentucky farmer, has continued to farm, but he's also really a sort of poet-philosopher farmer. So he's trying to think about all these things at once. And in this lecture he said this. He said, a positive cause is the by now well-established effort to build or rebuild local economies, starting with economies of food. Its purpose, to the extent possible, is to bring producers and consumers, causes and effects, back within the bounds of neighborhood, which is to say the effective reach of imagination, sympathy, affection, and all else that neighborhood implies. Bringing our world back down, in some ways shrinking our world back down to a sense of neighborhood, which I don't know about you, but for me is a concept that's largely lost. Neighborhood, well, I'm lucky if I know my neighbors on this side and that side and maybe across the street, right? Put me 2 or 3 houses down, I don't know who lives there. Much less some sense of neighborhood that is a community in which we have something shared in common, or even some sense of affection because we don't see each other, because we just drive off in the morning and then we drive back at night and then we park our cars. And we don't see and encounter those with whom we might build affection, but we don't have the opportunity to. What Barry's talking about here in terms of economies of food is thinking about how we return to practices of local food production. And how do we support those practices? How do we support, say, CSAs, community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, places where you might actually encounter the grower of your food, so that you can say hello, so that you can talk about how good those tomatoes look. It's small, it's really small. It's not friendship, but it's affection. It's the way of building affection. But part of it is the intentionality of saying, how can I reshape some of my food buying practices so that I actually come into contact with food producers again? And in doing that, begin to build connections that are largely lost to us. So as a farmer, this is one of the things that Barry thinks about a lot. I'm going to jump ahead of that slide, even though it's awesome. This slide, the Electric City Roasting Company, is just an example of a business that I'm aware of, that I got to know the owner of the business quite a bit when I visited this coffee shop. But it's a business that tries to run the business in exactly that way, to build relations of affection. So as a coffee company, they're involved in direct trade with particular farms in Central America. Mary Telly, the owner, and manager flies down to Central America. She gets to know the farmers. She talks to them about the kinds of beans she needs. They work together to produce the product that then she brings back to the US and sells. But it's a model of business where creating relationships of affection is at the heart of what she does. In Matthew 13:33, we are told to be leaven. We're told to be leaven in the midst of the world. And I think being people who seek to bring that affection into the midst of our world and our lives is one way that we provide leaven in the midst of an isolated world. And what I'd like to do is close out with about 3 minutes of a short video. And in this 3 minutes, this is basically a section of David Foster Wallace's commencement address at Kenyon College some years back. Some of you may know that a couple of years ago, Wallace tragically committed suicide. So there's a darkness underneath some of the beauty that he describes for us here. But this is just a video that somebody produced over top of the audio recording of just a section of that commencement address. It's about 3.5 minutes long. But I wanted to share this with you because to me it said so much about what affection in the everyday would look like, what it would look like to actually be that leaven, that yeast in the midst of an isolated culture.
The point is that petty, frustrating crap like this is exactly where the work of choosing is going to come in.
And I need to actually go back because I wanted to preface this for you because he starts in the middle of a sentence. So what he's done for these Kenyon College students is to say, hey, congratulations, you're graduating, welcome to adult life. And there's a whole lot of adult life that's just hard and tedious and boring, and it's going to drive you crazy, right? Welcome to being adults. And so what he's talking about is, look, what about all the just ordinary stuff of fighting traffic and having to get through the grocery store with a whole lot of people who are, you know, running their carts into each other, and it's too crowded and you've got to wait long and it's the end of the day and you're tired. That's the stuff he thought these graduates needed to hear. right? So this actually picks up midway as he's trying to say, what do we do? Because that is the world you're going to inhabit. To some extent, this will be your life, right? Time spent in traffic, time spent waiting in lines. How do you not let that make you miserable? Right? So that's kind of where he is at this point in his talk. So I wanted to preface that a bit because he sort of jumps in. But you'll see where he's going with this, with that preface.
The point is that petty, frustrating crap like this is exactly where the work of choosing is going to come in. Because the traffic jams and crowded aisles and long checkout lines give me time to think. And if I don't make a conscious decision about how to think and what to pay attention to, I'm going to be pissed and miserable every time I have to shop. Because my natural default setting is the certainty that situations like this are really all about me. About my hungriness and my fatigue and my desire to just get home. And it's going to seem for all the world like everybody else is just in my way. And who are all these people in my way? And look at how repulsive most of them are, and how stupid and cow-like and dead-eyed and non-human they seem in the checkout line. Or in how annoying and rude it is that people are talking loudly on cell phones in the middle of the line. And look at how deeply, personally unfair this is. If I choose to think this way in the store and on the freeway, fine. Lots of us do. Except thinking this way tends to be so easy and automatic that it doesn't have to be a choice. It is my natural default setting. It's the automatic way that I experience the boring, frustrating, crowded parts of adult life when I'm operating on the automatic, unconscious belief that I am the center of the world and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priorities. The thing is that, of course, there are totally different ways to think about these kinds of situations. In this traffic, all these vehicles stop and idle in my way. It's not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accidents in the past, and now find driving so terrifying that their therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge, heavy SUV so they can feel safe enough to drive. Or I can choose to force myself to consider the likelihood that everyone else in the supermarket's checkout line is just as bored and frustrated as I am. And that some of these people probably have much harder, more tedious, or painful lives than I do. Again, please don't think I'm giving you moral advice, or that I'm saying you're supposed to think this way, or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard. It takes will and effort. And if you're like me, some days you won't be able to do it, or you just flat out won't want to. But most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of her husband who's dying of lung cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicles department who just yesterday helped her spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's also not impossible. It just depends what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is and doing what is really important, if you want to operate in your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that are annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to think, how to pay attention, then you will know you have other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that lit the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down.
What David Foster Wallace is describing, I think, in this little portion of his wonderful commencement address is this possibility that we might become agents of affection. Right? It's not the language he uses, but it's certainly the idea he's getting across. To be good news is to be those whose lives enact a profound yes to the isolated world around us. The way of Christ can never be indifferent to the world God made and to the way we inhabit it. in a beautiful novel by Dave Eggers entitled "You Shall Know Our Velocity." He has this great line. He says, "When we pass by another person without telling them we love them, it is cruel and wrong, and we all know this." Maybe a bit overstated, but fairly powerful. I remember reading that line when I was sitting in an airport in the midst of a whole bunch of strangers waiting for a plane to arrive. And I wondered what would happen if we had some simple way to acknowledge that no one is simply a stranger to one another. If we had a way to acknowledge that through the image of God, that oneness of all things deep down could not but shine through. I knew, of course, that if I began telling everyone around me that I loved them, it would probably just seem creepy. Nonetheless, what Dave Eggers is saying, what Wallace is saying, what Wendell Berry is saying, what C.S. Lewis is saying, is helping us imagine a world in which these bonds of affection can grow. And they can grow through paying attention and nurturing the connection of all things that is real and that is deep and that is dependent on a God whose love sustains every moment of our existence. To be formed as a people of affection, which is the ignored and undervalued of the four loves, is to be a people capable of stewarding creation well, noticing, enduring, enjoying, and ultimately maybe even appreciating the cross-section of humanity whom we meet every day, bearing good news into the most ordinary quotidian moments of our rushed and harried lives. Faith, hope, and love. Stewardship programs, educational curriculum, community building, outreach ministries, evangelism strategies. And the greatest of all of these is love. Thank you.